The Garden Report is powered by Prize Picks, the exclusive daily fantasy partner of the CLNS Media Network.
Hey, Bobby Manning here. Welcome to a studio edition of the Garden Report. Noah Dalzell here from Celtics blog. We haven't done this in a while since we've been in different cities and the NBA Finals and parades and everything else. So the off-season pretty much came and went in a week, Noah. Celtics pretty much did all their work over the past week here. So it's a good time to recap it, look ahead to the Summer League, and then it'll pretty much be summertime for this team. I know Jason Tatum's out there in Las Vegas saying he's got to celebrate some more. He's got to take some more time to celebrate this thing, and that's how I'm feeling because we got right in the off-season mode pretty much here. The draft. Celtics had a couple guys in the draft, and then they're going to go right in the Summer League and the Olympics. So there's a lot going on. We're really not going to stop for a long period of time here, but now that all this free agency work is done, we can pretty much move on to summer vacation and eventually the Olympics in late July. But let's go over what happened. Xavier Tillman, I think the biggest surprise to me, he re-signs 2 years at the minimum. They signed Cornette, and they kept Cater around, and I heard that was going to be enough, as far as depth goes. Maybe they would bring in another body or something if that happened, but at that point, I was thinking Tillman was probably out the door, especially since there's a lot of teams out there that still have cap space. He was, after Mo Wagner signed, the best center on the market, probably left, and he stays at the minimum, which is amazing to me. 2 years, guaranteed, no option. He's here on the minimum. So a major win for the Celtics among many to start this offseason, but that one surprised me the most by far.
Yeah, I mean, they pretty much have the whole group back, and we're 2 days into free agency. So I thought it would take a little bit longer. Xavier Tillman, like you said, I didn't see that coming on the minimum. I thought maybe they found a way to keep him for a little bit more than that, but I assumed somebody out there would be willing to offer him like 2 years, $10 million, something like that, even a little bit less. But so he's back, and I thought that he had really positive moments during the playoff run, obviously pretty limited, but the fact that he's willing to come back, despite the fact that he didn't have major minutes at all, it wasn't a kind of a staple of the rotation. It just goes to show you how much he enjoyed being a part of this group and how much everybody did, right? We have Kata's back. I think that's a 3-year deal. Luke Cornette back on a 1-year deal. So all of those guys, just a couple weeks ago, we were talking about what's going to happen with the front court, assuming that we weren't going to be able to see all of them back. We were thinking maybe 1 or 2, and they're going to have to fill the gaps in other ways. And you got all 3 of them, right? So that's really good news, especially because we know Porzingis is going to be out for the first few months of the season. And then you also got the 2 extensions that you were hoping to see this summer, right? Both Derek White and Jason Tatum. So pretty much the best way that this offseason could have begun for the Celtics to bring back pretty much every player from last year's team, with the exception of O'Shea Brissett and Svi Mykhailiuk, who maybe one of those guys takes the last roster spot. But the continuity is like, I don't know when the last time we've seen something like this.
Yeah, it's rare. It has to be rare. I think about Wade, you lost Posey and some other guys from that team, PJ. Like, there was just different guys who broke off from that team after that season. So you were running back the same core, but you didn't quite have the same depth going into 2009. They were obviously great to start 2009, but this team could do something special to start this year. And obviously Porzingis isn't in the mix at the start of the year, and that's probably one of the big topics we would have debated or discussed here, is whether they can sustain without Porzingis, given the centers they have. Well, all those guys are back in terms of the depth there. And O'Shea, we'll see what happens there. He wasn't a huge part of complementing the depth. They'd play small sometimes last year, and I don't think they're going to do that this time around with all these centers available to them. So that could point toward him possibly departing. I know that's where the reporting seems to be pointing toward. But the door is open for that. And if you bring him back on top of all these other centers, you have everything you need to get by without Porzingis. And it's going to take some steps forward from these guys, right? Cornette was better last year than he was the year before. Tillman struggled to earn Joe's trust, I feel like, at different points. And his defense is amazing. His defensive versatility is almost unmatched at that position. But the offense, he really couldn't find his spot. I think he shot 24% for the year with Boston from 3 and didn't have much of a game around the basket to speak for. So he ended up a little bit lost on that end of the floor. I know injuries hampered him too. That knee cost him a couple different stretches. So he's going to have to figure out where he fits in offensively. And Cater's going to have to take some steps too if he's going to be part of the mix here. But those 3 guys effectively alongside Horford allowed you to win almost all the games you didn't have Porzingis last year. I think they only lost like 6 games with him out. So If it was just Kornet and Keita behind Horford, I'd be like, but now that you have Kornet, the switching guy, and Tillman and Keita who can maybe take a step forward, I think that's all you need to get by without Porzingis, at least for the start of the season.
Yeah, and I mean, all three of those guys also had their moments during last year. I mean, even Keita, who kind of faltered and fell out of the rotation in the latter half of the season. Yeah, so I think you trust that he's going to take another step. I watched him a lot when he was in Maine. He's an NBA-ready player, right? So there's obviously going to be questions around him and questions around just his knowledge. I think he has the right instincts in a lot of cases, and the fouling was way down last year from previous years. With Xavier Tillman in the offense, the one thing I'll say is, I feel like it was such limited opportunities that it is kind of hard to assess whether or not that was a real struggle. Like, I don't know I don't know if you have a sense of how many threes he actually attempted, but it's not like he was out here shooting 6-7 threes every time he checked in.
Maybe 30 or something, one a game.
Right, so the sample, so you have a couple games in the beginning of next year, and all of a sudden that number is a wash, right? Peyton Pritchard started the year couldn't make one shot for the first few weeks, right?
Yeah, and he always looked good in those warm-ups. I know
he
you
looked
watched
great in the
those.
warm-ups.
Yeah.
I have to say, I know that people shooting in warm-ups is not the most indicative thing of how they're going to perform in games, but I watch every single player warm up, and Xavier Tillman's in the upper group of players as far as it comes to shooting accuracy. So, and then one of the things you said that resonates is the 08 team, Paul Pierce has talked about this, how he felt like not being able to retain that group really cost them. I think a lot of teams, when you look at teams that won one championship and are never to get back over the hump, they go back and they look at all the guys that they lost. And Joe Mazzulla's talked about how he studied championship teams and studied multiple championship teams. And one of the things you see is if you can keep your guys together, that really helps. And so it was obviously a priority. Brad Stevens mentioned last week, they've earned the right to run it back with this group. And then he, proceeded to re-sign everybody that he could.
So I still have some concerns going into next year about Porzingis, just because this is a rare injury. We don't know how he's going to recover from it. Will he have to ramp up around Christmas time? Will he be ready to go around Christmas time? Those are real questions, and a lot of the responsibility is going to fall on Horford. There's no way around it, and there'll be back-to-backs where he has to sit out, and it's just going to be Kornet, Keita, Tillman at that point. And again, they got by in the games where they had to do that last year. But the one thing I asked going into free agency, and I don't feel this way as much now because they kept everybody, so they have an option for different situations here. But would they have been better off consolidating all that money into one center who's capable of doing spot starts, who could play for 2 weeks as a starter if Horford had to miss a week or two due to an injury? Or are they better off with, having Kornet for the drop matchups, having Tillman for matchups where you want to switch, and hoping that Keita can take some developmental steps there? That's where I'm still a little torn, because obviously a name they've liked and a name that's been floated around them forever is Drummond. He goes to Philly for the 2-year deal, a little bit more expensive, but probably about what you paid all of these guys combined. So, right, you're right. The continuity was a priority for them. That's important, especially for the locker room. But from a basketball standpoint, if Horford has to miss a week or two, are they in some trouble at this point, given that Porzingis is out?
I don't think during the regular season. I'm not worried at all about that early couple months stretch because A, you can afford to lose a few games. B, historically, you haven't seen them lose games just because Porzingis is out, right? Like you said, they've consistently won with that group of front court players. What I do worry about is the playoffs. And it's the same concern that we had this past year. I just don't think you can count on Porzingis being healthy for a playoff run. You want to hope that he can do it, but historically speaking, he usually can't. And so you have to be able to proceed and think about your team. Can your roster win the championship without him? And I do think this past year, I always felt confident that they could. I mean, we talked about it before every series. I always said that, right? That they can do this without him, and they ultimately kind of had to, right? Despite him contributing, majorly contributing in the first few games of the finals. And I don't see a reason why this, if they were able to do it last year, they won't be able to do it this year. The one thing I'll say is I think they got they avoided some of the, the best front court players in the league, some of the best bigs in last year's playoff run. And I don't know how things change if you're now facing, Giannis and Embiid and all that. But Porzingis is not really the guy for those things anyways, right? So I think the point being is that Al Horford is as important to this team as ever. And you just have to believe in him and believe that that's okay, right? And everything we've seen, it seems to be fine. I think it's just on paper, people are like, okay, he's 38 now. He's going to be 39 next June. Are we being naive to think that he can be a fixture of this team? And I think you just have to accept that he's still the guy that he's been the last few years.
Yeah, and he's done it. And you have to trust that he's going to continue to do it because that's what they've signed up for here effectively with the way they've built this roster. And it worked last year. You basically won the playoffs, the finals, without Porzingis involved really at all for most of that run. So I think that gives you some confidence in the group they have depth-wise and Horford himself. And you didn't have much money to throw around, and that brings us to that money conversation because beyond these minimum signings they've made here, they signed some hefty extensions. And obviously, Derek White, first and foremost, a major win on the surface. They're going to have to be thrilled that he did not go to free agency, that he did not chase 175, 200 million, because that probably ends up in him being gone. Instead, he takes 126 or so here, 30 million a year, starts at 28. Just an unthinkable bargain, really, for a player like that. And again, a sign of how good the room is, how much guys want to be here, all of that. But it's still unprecedentedly expensive. Almost $1 billion in contracts for the starters.
It's crazy.
Tatum signs for $315, which was never in doubt. So he's locked up now long term. Brown signed his supermax, so he's going to start making $50 million this next year. Porzingis still has 2 years of $30 million each, and then you get to Holiday, who has $134 beyond all of that. So the tax bill is going to be okay this year because Tatum's not starting that deal yet. I think it's going to come out to like around 40, 50-ish in tax. But next year, you become a repeater tax team, and this roster is probably going to cost close to $500 million for that 1 year. And so that's the year you're going to have to make some tough decisions here. But the good thing is, and we'll see what happens with Sam Hauser, he's really going to push them toward 500 if they extend him. I think you enjoy next year. You run it back next year. Certainly, that's what you've been allowed to do. What's it, 14 guys back from that roster now at this point? You have 8 guys back for 2026, and it could be 9 if Hauser signs up. So that's the way to go, right? You keep everybody around. You can make some changes later, but no one's going to leave for nothing because once you're locked into this money, you don't really want to be let out, and we can get to the ownership stuff too, but they're locked in. It's hugely expensive, and they're running it back. So it's great they're running it back. It's not great that it's hugely expensive. So are we looking at 1-2 years here where they're just going all in, and then after that we'll see? I don't know what's going to happen after that. Or could tough decisions be coming as soon as like 2026? That's going to be the big question here.
Well, I think part of it will be dependent on whether this team is able to put together another deep playoff run and maybe even win the championship again next year. Like, I think if you win the championship again next year, you kind of have to just keep rolling with it, right? Like, or if something crazy happens and they're a first round exit, like then you're starting to look at that tax bill a little bit differently, right? So it's hard to know from this point forward, and it's also the fact that the team is up for sale somewhat makes things more confusing and hard to predict. But
because whoever the next owner is could maybe assume that cost.
Right, and the question is like, this is not my expertise at all, so I don't want to even wade in here, but you'd think that whoever is going to purchase the majority stake in the team knows what they're signing up for and is able to do that.
Right.
And maybe that's part of what's happening here, right? So, again, this stuff is above my head, but I think that clearly they've committed as an organization to pay these guys. Everybody's kind of looking at it being like, how is this even possible, right? And the starting 5, but really, there's not really overpays on the team. It's just the talent that you have on this roster, right? Like, they're actually getting pretty good deals for them. I mean, everything we've seen in the last few days, but yeah, I think it just depends on what you see happen next year and the year after. Obviously, you just won the championship, so it's really easy to extend everybody and re-sign everybody when the outcome was the outcome that every team hopes and prays for, right? And then it gets trickier when you're 2 years out removed from winning a championship, and suddenly you're like like the Bucks, like after you win 2021, and now next thing you know, it's been a couple of tough playoff runs. Next, you send away the guy that helped you win, right? So things change quickly, but I think right now they're at a place where obviously these were no-brainers. All of these signings were no-brainers.
Yeah, and you have flexibility by having these kind of deals, and I think that's why they're trying to extend Hauser, is have that medium to small size contract as a piece that they can move down the line if they need to break up the roster into multiple young guys, or even just offload some money, which is probably where you're going to be looking at Porzingis that year. Like, he'll be a $30 million expiring. Maybe someone will just take that on, trying to have him be that final piece for them, or someone who can really upgrade their front court, and the Celtics would just be able to move 30 off the books that way. And is Tillman the replacement at that point? These are all questions for down the line. But it's going to be challenging. The league made it challenging. from a tax standpoint especially. I don't think the second apron stuff's going to hurt them as much because they just have all the pieces they need here. They don't really need to make too many trades or moves or anything like that, at least to add. So they're in a really good spot relative to the league. And when we look around the league right now, Nuggets had to move on from KCP, do the second apron or tax or whatever that was, but that's a real big loss for them, and they're trying to replace him with Russell Westbrook, it seems like. We'll see how that goes. Clippers lose Paul George. Sixers pick him up, so that's probably one that is just pretty lateral for the Celtics in terms of their competition. And the Knicks make more of an all-in move, adding Mikal Bridges, but that costs them with the hard cap, Isaiah Hartenstein. So that is the big moves that basically affect the Celtics. There's really nothing out there that makes you go, wow, the Celtics are in trouble or that team could threaten them. But the one thing I've said is that the margin for error is a little smaller. Porzingis is out, Celtics may be a little thinner, and these other teams got a little bit better. And as you mentioned earlier, you might have to face some of the teams you didn't face last year, like Milwaukee, like Philly, like New York.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Philadelphia, I know Boston fans are never worried about Philadelphia because of historically, Celtics have kind of had, the Sixers number. I do think you have to take that team seriously because if you have a healthy Joel Embiid, which is a big if, but if you do have him for a playoff run with a Tyrese Maxey who's now not even in his prime yet and already an all-star, and then you add Paul George, who I've always thought, at least for the last few years, like he's not a number one guy, but now he can be the number 3 guy. He can be like the guy you can't put your best defenders on, right? So I think they could be a really dangerous team, and I thought they were really dangerous this year as well before everything kind of went awry for them from a health standpoint. But they were the 1-2 best. It was Celtics and Philadelphia for the first stretch of the season until Joel Embiid went down and they totally fell through the rankings. And I also think if they had Paul George for that stint, they wouldn't have lost as many games as they did. They really didn't have much going on outside of Tyrese Maxey. So I think they're going to be a serious opponent and a serious contender here. I still think the Celtics have an advantage over them, but I feel like they've been a little bit dismissed just because it's like Philadelphia and they never get anywhere and they never beat the Celtics. But there have been some close calls over the years, and now they're just a better team than they were historically, and with a good coach.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, who played Boston the toughest last year in your mind?
In this most recent playoff run?
In the whole year.
Oh. It's hard to say during the season because I'd probably say Denver.
Okay,
right?
That's
Denver,
a fair one.
They were 0-2, and it was looking a little scary. But from the playoff run, I would say Indiana.
You got to go Indiana. You got to go Denver. Philly early in the season, they beat them in Philly, and they played a close one in Philly, too, in those early games. So
yeah.
My mind goes there for sure. Milwaukee played them tough.
Yeah, Milwaukee was weird. They got blown out both times they went there.
Yeah.
I just don't know. I don't know what they're doing right now, but that team, they're not making upgrades on that roster the same way that other teams in the league are. So you're banking on like Damian Lillard having a great season and Giannis having a great season and that being enough,
Their top 5 still pretty good. They got to find a 5th piece for that starting lineup. I don't know how they're going to do that. I know there's been some talk of trading Lopez. That would almost completely redefine their team. And their draft was weird, too. They got Tyler Smith and A.J. Johnson, 2 19-year-olds, who probably aren't going to help them in the near term. So they're in a weird spot, but you always have to respect Giannis.
Yeah.
And then I guess the other team out west you're looking at that I actually think is going to be the toughest opponent for them is Oklahoma City if it comes to that. And they went out and got Hartenstein. They went out and made some serious moves. So those are my 5 next year that you have to look at. But some of them are in the west, Denver and Oklahoma City. And some in the east still have some serious questions. So the Celtics still go into next year's prohibitive favorites to me.
Yeah, I think they're the favorites. But like we said this year, there's so much that can go wrong and there's so much that has to go right to win a championship. So it's tough, right? Like you mentioned Oklahoma City. I still think Denver is going to be really, really dangerous next year. I feel like people are getting a little bit caught up in the KCP exit as like almost like dismissing Denver now.
The young guys have to come through. I know they had homes too.
But you still have Jokic, Jamal Murray, who didn't have a good playoff run this year, and I think that was a big part of why they weren't able to get out. You have Aaron Gordon, who at his best, those 3 guys are enough to be a real threat at any point. It's just bizarre because I think they're a couple moves away from being a really scary team when they're just not making those moves. And so it feels like they're almost like giving everybody a break, everybody else in the league a little bit of a break. Like, we're not going to be as good as we possibly could be, but they're still really dangerous. Also think Minnesota is really dangerous.
They should be on the list for sure.
Yeah, in hindsight, it's kind of bizarre that they weren't able to beat Dallas, like when you look back, but I think they've made some good moves. They're only going to get better, that group, at least this upcoming year. And then I also don't think you can dismiss Dallas, because Dallas was just in the finals, and I like the Klay Thompson addition. I'm a big Klay Thompson fan, but I think that he's gonna be. I mean, think about it in the finals, like how many airball threes we saw, how many guys we saw that just like weren't able to space the floor for Luka and Kyrie, and a guy like Klay Thompson would have really helped. I've seen people say like, what would have happened? I think Celtics still win the way that they did, but it would have made a difference.
Yeah, and they went out and got the guy from New Orleans there too, the wing.
Najee
Marshall. So they've made some upgrades for sure, but that's all out west. It's good to be in the East. I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor here, Game Time. Go to the Game Time app and download it and use the code CLNS, and you're going to get $20 off your first purchase over there. Of course, terms apply. It's summer, so there's still a lot going on. You got your Red Sox games, baseball across the country. There's always great deals on baseball games, but the best are on Game Time, and you'll get them right up until and even a little bit after game time. So head over there, whether it's baseball, whether it's the WNBA going on right now, you want to go down to Connecticut, see what's going on down there, or concerts and events. I got some good concert tickets over there on the Game Time app on Friday. So go over there and use that code CLNS. Help out the Garden Report, help out CLNS, and help yourself. Great experience over there on that app. You can see where you're sitting. They got a great view of your seat available on the app here. So all of that and more is available over in the Game Time app. Again, use the code CLNS. Get $20 off your first purchase, of course. Terms apply. I want to look ahead because who knows when we're going to record again here ahead of the holiday. Summer League coming up quick. We got USA Camp. Tatum, Holiday looks like they're going to be part of that. White probably not because it looks like Kawhi's actually going to play. But Summer League, you have to think it's going to be Jordan Walsh going for his second run out there after a good season. It's going to be interesting to see how much he dominates at this level, because usually the guy who comes back off a pretty good rookie year ends up dominating Summer League and even taking a seed early. Baylor Shireman, of course, the draft pick. You want to get a good look at him, as well as Anton Watson, who will probably be like the 4 on this team. And then, who knows among the younger guys on the roster. Cater just re-signed. He could be out there. You got Jaden Springer, who probably needs some more run after the playoffs there. And some of the other younger and two-way guys in the mix here, too. And then, of course, you're always going to bring in some other pieces here. So it could be an interesting team. Of course, everyone wants to see what Shireman's going to look like in a Celtics uniform, and he can obviously do a lot of stuff to wow you out there with the ball in his hands. So he's going to have that opportunity. And then Watson, is he a 4? Is he a 5? That's something I'm interested in seeing. Is he hitting threes? Because as Brad Stevens said, they want him to shoot like never before. So it's going to be a pretty exciting Summer League team, as it often is for the Celtics.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I know we're going to be out there, but I think those names that you mentioned, Jordan, I don't think Jordan Walsh is going to dominate Summer League. That's not the kind of player that he is. Like, he didn't dominate in Maine. He's not a guy that's going to have the ball in his hands, like, creating for himself or things like that. So I would just say people that are somewhat tuning into Summer League, I wouldn't box score watch, because I don't think he's going to blow you out of the water as far as that goes. But can he look a little bit more calm than he did last year? Can he look like the 3 balls falling? Those little things, can he kind of make progress in those regards? I thought JD kind of struggled in Summer League last year at points, and so he was a guy that there was a lot of pressure, second year back, are you going to dominate? And sometimes it also doesn't go in that direction. So, curious, maybe we'll see him. I know Drew Peterson's another guy who they picked up the option on, and so, curious kind of what he looks like. I thought he had his moments in Maine, but kind of up and down. But someone clearly that they went out and are trying to work with and was with them for this playoff run. So it could end up being that there's a lot of familiar faces, which is fun to watch. And I mean, you mentioned Keita. He's someone that
he's the guy who will dominate.
He's a guy that will dominate. Yeah. And I think he's a guy that in Maine for stretches just looked like he didn't belong, right? So the key in Summer League is like, you kind of want to, if you're one of those guys that, third year in the league, you want to look like you shouldn't be there, right? That you should be sitting out the remainder of the program. I don't think Jordan's one of those guys just based off his style. Wouldn't be surprised if Baylor Shireman looks really good. Some of these older players, I think they come in and they just have an easier transition, but it'll be fun to watch just the mix of talent and everything. And, it's interesting how the Celtics approached their draft this year with the, mostly picking older players and having the younger guys be guys that have actually been with the organization for a couple of years now. And Brad mentioned that guys were coming in for workouts and they were oftentimes almost, usually older than the guys that were finishing practice. And so it's going to be a fun mix.
Yeah, for sure. And the guy you want to watch is Walsh, because he could conceivably enter the mix this year. If O'Shea leaves, if Shvee leaves, if they keep that spot open, there is some room for a guy like him to break into the mix and maybe play a little bit next year. I know that's not the plan right now, but if he has a big summer league, if he has a big camp, all of a sudden you're talking about maybe him being in Boston a little bit more than Maine, which was where he spent most of his time last year. Obviously, Queta, they'll need. I'm sure we won't see a ton of him if he does play, just because they're going to need those minutes during the regular season. You don't want to risk injury or anything like that. And the other guys down there are probably going to be future names to look at. I don't think Watson's going to play a ton this year. I don't think Shireman's going to play a ton this year. So those are more toward the future, but this stuff's becoming more important, as we talked about. Expensive roster. These kind of guys are going to have to contribute for the Celtics at some point as pieces start to break off into the future. So figuring out who is part of that is what they're doing right now, and I think we'll get a pretty good look at that this month.
Yeah, and I'm curious if there's an opportunity for someone to break into the rotation, because the tough thing with bringing everybody back is that you're not really opening the door for someone to get significantly increased minutes from last year, right? Like, we saw Peyton Pritchard was a beneficiary of the fact that they lost guards, right? You don't really have an obvious play like that because everybody's back. I guess Porzingis is the one where he's going to miss the beginning of the season, but he also missed the playoff run. That being said, playoff rotations are different, so I think we're maybe, they probably would have played more guys if it was just regular season basketball. But yeah, I could see Jordan Walsh breaking into the mix at some point in a limited capacity. I don't think he'll be in Maine quite as much as he was this year, but I do think he'll be there quite a bit. I've heard Brad Stevens is really high on him, so I think that he's someone that they want in Boston. They want to kind of shuffle him back as much as he can. Jaden Springer is another one that is interesting just because...
It's kind of make or break time for him this year.
Yeah. When he played in Maine, he played in Atlanta when we were out there and he was in that G League game, and he looked like he didn't really belong in the G League either. So, I think he has a lot of upside as well. So yeah, just curious to see if someone kind of separates themselves from that pack, because it is on paper, there's a lot of potential for each guy, but then you put them all on a basketball court together, and sometimes there's a natural one or two players that just stands out.
Yeah, they also signed an undrafted free agent from Amsterdam, Cleveland State, and Aruna, I think his name is. So they're excited about him as well. We'll get a look at him for the first time on that Summer League roster as well. Could he be in the mix for a two-way spot? We'll find out pretty quickly out there. Someone usually does emerge that's unexpected from these Summer League settings. And that's it for us. Our next coverage will be from Summer League training camp and then out in Vegas for the Vegas Summer League. Noah will be out there. I will as well. And we'll have all the coverage of whoever ends up on that roster, and that should be announced pretty soon here, the final roster for the Celtics Summer League team. Always a fun time, and then it's the off season. So work done fast and furious for the Celtics. They re-signed Tillman, re-signed Cornette, re-signed Queta, and Brissett is probably next on that list to make a decision. So we'll have coverage of all that when it happens. But for now, Noah Dalzell, Celtics blog by Manning, CLNS Media, subscribe to Celtics All Access, and of course show our sponsor Game Time some love with the code CLNS. I'm Bobby Manning. This has been a studio edition of the Garden Report. We'll talk to you soon.